Max Harper liked his life quiet and orderly. Nestled on the outskirts of Eldridge, his home, a modest cabin surrounded by a lush greenhouse, was his sanctuary. The greenhouse was his pride and joy, filled with rare and vibrant plants he'd nurtured from across the world. Here, time was marked by the blooming of orchids and the rustling of leaves in the wind. If Max ever felt lonely, he told himself it was better this way. Plants didn't ask questions or need complicated answers. But on that fateful evening, his tranquil life was shattered. It started as a faint hum in the air. At first, Max thought it was a low-flying plane, but the sound grew louder and more erratic, accompanied by a brilliant streak of light that blazed across the night sky. It vanished over the treetops, followed by a deafening crash that shook the ground beneath his feet. Max grabbed his jacket, flashlight, and an old hunting knife, more for comfort than necessity. His dog, Baxter, barked nervously, circling his legs as he made his way into the dense woods. "Stay," Max ordered, scratching behind the dog's ears. Baxter whimpered but obeyed, watching him disappear into the darkness. The forest was eerily silent as Max trudged through the underbrush, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. He followed the smell of burnt ozone and the faint glow ahead until he reached the crash site. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. A small pod-like craft, sleek and metallic, lay embedded in the earth. Steam hissed from its fractured hull, and the surrounding trees were scorched as if touched by fire. Max stepped closer, his heart pounding. He wasn't one to believe in aliens or UFOs, but there it was, unmistakably otherworldly. And then he saw her. She was crouched beside the wreckage, her body trembling. Her skin shimmered like the surface of a lake under the moonlight, shifting colors with her every movement. Her eyes, large, luminous, and impossibly expressive, locked onto his. She had a humanoid form, but there was no mistaking her for human. She was otherworldly, ethereal, like something from a dream. Max raised his hands, trying to appear non-threatening. "Hey, I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly, though he doubted she understood. The girl flinched, clutching her side. Her movements were sluggish, and as she shifted, Max saw why. Her torso was smeared with a strange, silvery liquid that seemed to pulse faintly. Blood? He couldn't be sure, but it was clear she was injured. Okay, Max murmured, stepping closer. She didn't bolt, though her eyes stayed fixed on him, wary and alert. He crouched down, setting his flashlight on the ground. Slowly, he extended his hand. "I can help." She hesitated, her gaze flicking between his hand and his face. Finally, as if out of desperation, she reached out and grasped his hand. Her touch was cool and smooth, like polished stone. "Let's get you out of here," Max said, helping her to her feet. She winced, leaning heavily against him as they made their way back through the woods. By the time they reached the cabin, Max was drenched in sweat and his heart was still racing. Baxter barked furiously at the sight of the stranger, but Max quieted him with a sharp command. "Not now, Bax." He led the alien girl into the greenhouse, the only place with enough space and warmth to house her. Gently, he laid her on a pile of blankets and set about examining her injury. Her blood, or whatever it was, glowed faintly in the dim light. Max grabbed his first aid kit, though he had no idea how human medicine would affect her. "Stay still," he said, dabbing at the wound with a clean cloth. She winced but didn't pull away. As he worked, she studied him, her expression a mixture of curiosity and fear. When he finished, she murmured something in a language he couldn't understand, soft and melodic, like wind chimes. Though he didn't know the words, he recognized the intent. She was thanking him. "It's okay," Max replied, giving her a small smile. "You're safe here." The girl's luminous eyes softened, and for the first time, her body seemed to relax. Later that night, as Max sat by her side, watching her chest rise and fall in steady breaths, he couldn't help but wonder what he had gotten himself into. Who was she? Where had she come from? And most importantly, what would happen when the world found out? For now, though, those questions could wait. Max leaned back, the sound of rain tapping gently against the greenhouse roof, and closed his eyes. The alien girl was safe. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on. The first few days with Lyra, as Max came to call her, were challenging but manageable. Despite the language barrier, she showed remarkable intelligence, quickly picking up basic English words and mimicking his gestures to communicate. Max discovered she had an almost childlike fascination with the plants in his greenhouse, marveling at the vibrant orchids, ferns, and tropical species that filled the room with life. She seemed to thrive in the warmth and humidity, her skin glowing faintly when she touched the leaves, as if drawing energy from them. Max had never seen anything like it, but then again, he'd never sheltered an alien before. One morning, Lyra startled him by rearranging the greenhouse. Max woke to find his carefully organized pots of herbs and flowers in bizarre patterns on the floor, forming spirals and intricate shapes that seemed deliberate, almost ceremonial. At first, he was annoyed, but her delighted expression as she stepped back to admire her work softened his frustration. "Lyra, you can't just dash," he sighed, gesturing to the scattered pots. This was all organized. She tilted her head, her iridescent eyes narrowing in what Max was beginning to recognize as confusion. Then she pointed to the spirals and mimed the growth of a plant with her hands, her voice lilting as she spoke in her musical language. Max frowned. "Are you saying they'll grow better like this?" Lyra nodded enthusiastically, her skin shimmering a faint blue. Though skeptical, Max decided to leave the arrangement as it was. Over the next few days, to his astonishment, the plants began to flourish. His tomatoes grew twice as large, the orchids bloomed with vibrant colors he'd never seen before, and even his usually temperamental herbs thrived. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Max muttered, shaking his head as he watered the plants. Lyra watched him with a smile, her eyes twinkling. As the days passed, Max began to notice subtle changes in her behavior. Lyra, once shy and reserved, became increasingly energetic. She would pace the greenhouse restlessly, humming strange melodies that filled the air with an almost hypnotic resonance. At night, her skin emitted a soft glow that pulsed rhythmically, casting faint patterns on the walls. Max couldn't deny that she was beautiful, but her presence also began to feel different. "Are you feeling okay?" Max asked one evening as she sat cross-legged on the floor, weaving delicate strands of ivy into intricate braids. Lyra looked up, her expression unreadable. She placed a hand over her chest, as if trying to find the words, then shook her head slowly. Worried, Max grabbed a notepad and began sketching a crude outline of a human figure, pointing to various body parts. "Does it hurt here? Or here?" Lyra studied the drawing, then took the pencil and added a glowing core at the center of the figure's chest. She tapped it lightly, her gaze serious. "Your core?" Max guessed, frowning. "Energy?" She nodded. Later that night, as Max worked in his office, he decided to dig deeper into the strange device Lyra had salvaged from her crash. The sleep communicator was unlike anything he'd ever seen, with a translucent screen that projected alien symbols into the air. Over the past week, Max had managed to decipher a few basic functions, mostly by trial and error. As he sifted through the device's data, a series of symbols caught his eye. They appeared to be diagrams of Lyra's species, detailing their physiology and life cycles. One symbol flashed repeatedly, accompanied by an alert tone that filled the room. "What the hell is this?" Max muttered, squinting at the alien text. Using a rudimentary translator app he had rigged up, he input the symbols and waited. The translation appeared on his laptop screen, and Max's heart skipped a beat. "Warning, mating cycle imminent." Max stared at the words, then glanced at the greenhouse, where Lyra's glow pulsed softly in the darkness. He scrolled through the document, skimming the details as panic set in. Arcadian females, it explained, entered a mating cycle once every solar year. During this time, their energy levels spiked, and their bodies underwent significant changes, including the production of a pheromone-like aura that could affect those around them. If not properly managed, the cycle could cause extreme physiological distress or worse. Max leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had no idea what properly managed meant, but one thing was clear: Lyra's strange behavior wasn't just recovery or curiosity. It was something far more complex and potentially dangerous. The next day, Max tried to approach the subject delicately. Over breakfast, his breakfast and the glowing blue fruit Lyra seemed to subsist on. He pointed to her chest and then mimicked the glowing pattern she'd shown him earlier. Lyra, he began, choosing his words carefully, your energy. It's changing, isn't it? She paused, her expression shifting to one of guarded understanding. Slowly, she nodded. Is it? Max hesitated. Is it dangerous? Are you okay? Lyra frowned, tapping her chest again. Then, with a soft hum, she reached out and touched his forehead. For a moment, Max's vision blurred, and he saw flashes of something: colors, sounds, and emotions that weren't his own. Loneliness. Longing. A desperate need to connect. When she pulled back, her eyes were shimmering with unshed tears. Max exhaled slowly, his chest tight with a mixture of empathy and unease. I don't know how to help you, he admitted softly. But I'll figure it out. Lyra gave him a small, grateful smile, though the tension in her gaze remained. As Max returned to his work, he couldn't shake the growing sense of urgency. Whatever was happening to Lyra, it wasn't just a personal issue, it was a ticking time bomb. And unless he found a solution, it was only a matter of time before her mating season brought consequences he couldn't control. The signs of Lyra's transformation became impossible to ignore. Her skin shimmered brighter, almost incandescent in the dim greenhouse light, and the air around her seemed charged with an invisible energy. The strange floral patterns she created with Max's plants became increasingly elaborate, taking over entire sections of the greenhouse. The once orderly space now resembled an alien jungle, filled with spirals, lattices, and woven shapes that seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. Max tried his best to keep up, but he felt like he was losing control. He spent hours researching Arcadian physiology using Lyra's communicator, struggling to make sense of the alien symbols and fragmented translations. The more he learned, the more alarmed he became. Her mating cycle wasn't just a biological phase, it was a profound transformation that could have unpredictable effects on her and those around her. One evening, as the full moon rose, Max found Lyra standing in the middle of the greenhouse, her glow so bright it illuminated the entire space. She was humming softly, her voice resonating in a way that made the plants around her quiver as if responding to her song. Max watched from the doorway, torn between awe and apprehension. Lyra, he called gently. What are you doing? She turned to him, her luminous eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. She gestured to the floral structures she had created and then placed a hand over her chest, as if trying to explain. You're preparing for something, aren't you? Max asked, stepping closer. Lyra nodded, her expression serious. She pointed to the communicator Max had been using and spoke in her melodic language, her tone urgent. I don't understand, Max said, frustration creeping into his voice. I'm trying, but I don't know how to help you. Lyra's gaze softened, and she stepped closer, placing her hand on his chest. The touch sent a jolt through Max, not painful but deeply unsettling. His vision blurred, and once again, he was overwhelmed by a cascade of emotions: loneliness, longing, and a desperate need for connection. But this time, there was something else, an undercurrent of guilt and fear, as if Lyra was trying to tell him she didn't want to hurt him. When she pulled away, Max staggered back, his heart racing. You're trying to warn me, he realized. But why? What's going to happen? Lyra opened her mouth to speak but stopped, her glow intensifying. She doubled over, clutching her chest, and let out a sound that was halfway between a cry and a song. Max rushed to her side, panic gripping him. "Lyra, are you okay?" he asked, supporting her as she struggled to stay upright. She looked up at him, her expression a mixture of pain and determination. Then, with trembling hands, she picked up the communicator and began inputting symbols at a frantic pace. The communicator projected a series of holographic images into the air. Max watched as the symbols and diagrams rearranged themselves into a crude representation of Arcadian mating cycles. The process wasn't just a biological necessity, it was a symbiotic exchange of energy, requiring the presence of another Arcadian to stabilize. Without this exchange, the buildup of energy could overwhelm the individual, leading to catastrophic results. Max's stomach dropped. "You need someone from your species to stabilize you," he said slowly. "But there's no one here. What happens if dash?" Lyra cut him off with a sharp gesture, her eyes pleading. She pointed to him, then to the communicator, and then back to herself, as if trying to say something important. "You're saying I can help?" Max asked, his voice hesitant. "How? I'm not one of you." Lyra nodded emphatically, then mimed a deep breath, placing her hand on her chest and exhaling slowly. Max realized she was trying to guide him through some kind of calming technique. "Okay," he said, his voice shaky. "I'll try." Following Lyra's lead, Max sat across from her and mirrored her movements, inhaling and exhaling deeply. As he focused, he felt a strange warmth spreading through his chest, as if her energy was resonating with his own. The glow around her began to stabilize, shifting from an erratic pulse to a steady rhythm. For a moment, Max thought they were making progress. But then, the energy in the room surged. The air grew thick and heavy, and Max's vision blurred again, this time accompanied by a sharp, ringing sound. Lyra cried out, her body trembling as the glow around her flared uncontrollably. "Lyra!" Max shouted, reaching for her. The moment his hand touched hers, a wave of energy shot through him, sending them both sprawling to the floor. When Max opened his eyes, the room was eerily silent. Lyra lay beside him, her glow dim but steady. Her breathing was shallow, but she seemed calmer. Max, on the other hand, felt like he'd run a marathon. His limbs were heavy, and his head throbbed with a dull ache. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Lyra opened her eyes and gave him a weak smile. She placed her hand over her chest and then pointed to him, her gaze filled with gratitude. "You're welcome," Max said with a faint chuckle. "But I think we're going to need a better plan." As the night wore on, Max helped Lyra back to her makeshift bed and sat beside her, the communicator clutched in his hands. He had no idea how long they could keep this up, but one thing was clear: if they didn't find a way to contact her people soon, the consequences could be dire. For both of them. "I won't let anything happen to you," Max murmured, brushing a strand of shimmering hair from her face. "We'll figure this out together." Lyra's eyes fluttered closed, and Max leaned back, staring at the glowing plants around him. The strange, alien jungle felt like a world unto itself, alive with possibilities and dangers he couldn't yet comprehend. But he was determined to see this through, no matter what it took. The first rays of dawn filtered through the greenhouse, illuminating the surreal scene inside. Max hadn't slept, his eyes heavy with exhaustion as he watched over Lyra. Her glow had stabilized to a soft, steady rhythm, but he knew the reprieve was temporary. The communicator on the table continued to flash with alerts and symbols Max couldn't decipher. Time was running out. After another failed attempt to use the communicator's interface, Max decided to try something desperate. He activated the distress beacon embedded in the device, which emitted a series of loud tones before falling silent. Lyra stirred, her eyes fluttering open as the signal sent ripples of faint energy through the air. "It's okay," Max assured her. "I sent out a distress call. If your people are out there, they'll find us." Lyra gave a faint smile, but her eyes were clouded with worry. She placed her hand over her chest again, the familiar gesture that spoke volumes. She wasn't just worried about herself, she was worried about what her energy might do to Max. Max shook his head. "I'll be fine. Just hang in there." Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional hum of the communicator. Max busied himself tending to the greenhouse, his mind racing with thoughts of what might happen if the Arcadians didn't arrive in time. He couldn't help but feel a pang of fear. Was he doing enough? Could he do enough? As the sun dipped below the horizon, the greenhouse was bathed in the soft glow of Lyra's creations. The alien plants seemed to pulse gently, as if alive with her energy. Max sat beside her, unsure what else he could do. And then, it happened. A bright light filled the sky, brighter than anything Max had seen before. It hovered above the greenhouse, a silvery ship descending slowly and silently. Max felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. He stood and moved to the door, shielding his eyes as the craft landed just outside his property. The ship's surface shimmered like liquid metal, shifting and rippling as a hatch opened. From it emerged three beings, their forms similar to Lyra's but taller, more imposing. Their skin glowed faintly, and they carried an air of authority. One of them stepped forward, speaking in the same melodic language as Lyra. Max couldn't understand the words, but the tone was gentle, almost reverent. Lyra sat up, her glow brightening as she extended her arms toward them. The lead Arcadian approached her, kneeling beside her and placing a hand on her chest. The air filled with a soothing hum, and Lyra's glow shifted to a soft, steady blue. The transformation was instant. Her tension melted away, and her breathing became calm and steady. One of the Arcadians turned to Max, their luminous eyes filled with gratitude. They placed a hand over their chest, mimicking Lyra's gesture of thanks. Max nodded, his heart pounding as he struggled to find the right words. "She's safe now, right?" he asked, his voice shaking. "She'll be okay?" The Arcadian tilted their head, as if processing his words, then nodded. Another Arcadian stepped forward, holding a small device that projected holographic symbols. To Max's surprise, it displayed a message in English. "Your compassion saved her. We owe you." Max exhaled, the weight of his worry lifting slightly. "I'm just glad she's all right." Lyra stood, steadied by her companions, and turned to Max. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she stepped forward, placing both hands over his chest. She spoke softly, her voice melodic and full of emotion. Though he couldn't understand the words, Max knew she was thanking him for his kindness, his care, and his willingness to risk so much for her. "You're welcome," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Take care of yourself, Lyra." She nodded, her glow brightening as she stepped back toward the ship. Before boarding, she reached into the folds of her garments and produced a small, glowing seed. She pressed it into Max's hand, closing his fingers around it. The seed pulsed faintly, warm to the touch. The holographic device translated, "A gift of life. A bond between our worlds." Max swallowed hard, nodding as she turned and disappeared into the ship. The Arcadians followed, their movements fluid and otherworldly. Moments later, the hatch closed, and the ship rose silently into the sky, vanishing into the stars. The greenhouse felt strangely quiet after they left. Max stood alone, staring at the glowing seed in his hand. He walked to one of his empty pots, filled it with soil, and planted the seed carefully. Almost immediately, it began to grow, sprouting delicate leaves that shimmered with an iridescent glow. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen, a living reminder of Lyra and her people. In the weeks that followed, Max's life returned to its usual rhythm, but he knew he'd been changed. The glowing plant in his greenhouse grew quickly, spreading vibrant vines that filled the space with light and life. It became the centerpiece of his work, drawing attention from botanists and researchers who marveled at its beauty. But for Max, it was more than just a plant. It was a symbol of the bond he'd shared with Lyra, a reminder that even in the vast expanse of the universe, compassion and connection could bridge worlds. And every night, As he looked up at the stars, Max wondered if she was out there, glowing softly in the darkness, remembering him as he remembered her.